I'm a trauma surgeon at Riverside Metropolitan Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 8 months ago, after 21 years of service. You can call me Dr. Elena Vasquez if you want. Though most people in our trauma department knew me as the Iron Lady during my 2 decades there, not because I was cold or unfeeling, but because I had developed a reputation for maintaining absolute composure during the most chaotic, blood-soaked emergencies that would send other surgeons into panic mode. I earned that nickname during my 3rd year of residency, when I once performed a 14-hour emergency surgery on a construction worker who had fallen from a 12-story building during a Phoenix high-rise project. Marcus Rodriguez was his name. I still remember every patient who pushed the boundaries of what I thought was medically possible. He had arrived at our trauma bay with catastrophic internal injuries, a ruptured spleen, lacerated liver, punctured lung, fractured skull, and compound fractures in both legs. His blood pressure had crashed to barely detectable levels, and he had clinically died twice during transport. Most attending physicians would have declared him DOA, but something about his case made me refuse to give up. I spent those 14 hours methodically repairing every damaged organ, rebuilding his shattered rib cage piece by piece, and manually pumping his heart when it stopped beating for the 3rd time on my operating table. The attending physician, Dr. James Morrison, later told me he had never seen a resident maintain such steady hands while a patient was literally dying and coming back to life repeatedly. Marcus not only survived, he returned to work 6 months later and sent me a Christmas card every year until I left Phoenix. That was just the beginning of what would become a career defined by impossible saves, last-minute miracles, and a gradually growing reputation for pulling patients back from the edge of death when other surgeons would have stepped away from the table. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the absolute limits of human survival. This case didn't just challenge my medical expertise, it completely shattered my understanding of what's scientifically possible, and ultimately led me to walk away from the profession that had defined my entire adult life. Riverside Metropolitan Medical Center is one of the premier Level 1 trauma centers in the southwestern United States, serving not only the greater Phoenix metropolitan area, but also rural Arizona, southern Nevada, parts of New Mexico, and even southeastern California. We're talking about a massive facility that handles over 240,000 emergency cases annually, with our trauma unit specifically designed to manage the most catastrophic injuries imaginable. The desert Southwest presents unique challenges for trauma medicine: car accidents on Interstate 10 during hurricane dust storms that reduce visibility to zero, industrial explosions at copper mining facilities, hiking accidents in the Superstition Mountains, where temperatures can reach 120 degrees, motorcycle crashes on desert highways, where medical help might be hours away, and the kind of devastating trauma that occurs when people push the limits of human endurance in one of the harshest environments in North America. Our trauma bay is equipped with technology that would have seemed like science fiction when I started my medical career. We have portable CT scanners that can produce detailed brain imaging within minutes of a patient's arrival, robotic surgical systems that allow precision beyond human capability, and life support equipment that can literally keep someone alive while we rebuild their internal organs from scratch. We maintain a helicopter landing pad that operates 24 hours a day, bringing us patients from accident scenes across hundreds of thousands of square miles of southwestern terrain. During my 21 years at Riverside Metropolitan, I performed over 4,200 emergency surgeries. I've operated continuously for 22 hours straight during mass casualty events like the multi-vehicle pileup on I-17 during the 2018 dust storm season that brought us 17 critical patients in a single afternoon. I've had my hands literally inside people's chest cavities, manually pumping hearts that had stopped beating, repairing aortas that had been severed by flying metal from car accidents, and reconstructing internal organs that had been pulverized by forces that should have been instantly fatal. I've reattached limbs that had been completely severed, hands cut off by industrial equipment, legs torn away in motorcycle accidents, even a man's arm that had been ripped from his shoulder when his shirt got caught in mining machinery. I've removed bullets from patients' brains while they remained conscious and talking to me, asking about their families and whether they would be able to return to work. I've pulled people back from clinical death so many times that the nursing staff started calling my operating room the resurrection chamber, though I always reminded them that there was nothing miraculous about advanced trauma surgery, just knowledge, preparation, and the refusal to give up when other people might consider a case hopeless. One case that exemplifies my approach involved Sarah Chen, a 24-year-old rock climber who fell nearly 200 feet in the Superstition Wilderness. When she arrived at our trauma center, she had been clinically dead for over 8 minutes. No pulse, no measurable brain activity, internal bleeding so severe that her blood pressure was undetectable. The paramedics had performed CPR for the entire helicopter flight, but her prognosis was essentially zero. Most trauma surgeons would have pronounced her dead and moved on to patients with better chances of survival. But something about Sarah's case, maybe her age, maybe the fact that her climbing partner was sobbing in our waiting room, maybe just my stubborn refusal to accept defeat, made me decide to fight for her. I opened her chest right there in the trauma bay and began manually compressing her heart while simultaneously ordering blood transfusions, emergency medications, and preparation for immediate surgery. For 3 hours, Sarah's heart stopped and started again 6 different times. I repaired her lacerated liver, removed a ruptured spleen, reconstructed her fractured ribs, and spent 45 minutes delicately extracting bone fragments from around her spinal cord. During the surgery, she flatlined twice more, and each time I refused to call the time of death. I kept working, kept pushing, kept believing that the human body could survive trauma that textbooks said was incompatible with life. Sarah Chen walked out of our hospital 7 weeks later. She returned to rock climbing within 6 months, and eventually became a wilderness rescue volunteer, helping to save other people who found themselves in the kind of life-threatening situations she had survived. She sends me updates about her adventures, her marriage, her children, constant reminders that sometimes the difference between life and death is simply a surgeon's willingness to keep fighting when logic says to give up. But I've also watched perfectly healthy college athletes die from injuries that seemed relatively minor, a simple slip and fall during an intramural basketball game that caused just the wrong kind of impact at just the wrong angle, resulting in catastrophic internal bleeding that no amount of surgical intervention could stop. I've seen robust construction workers in their 30s succumb to complications from injuries that looked manageable when they arrived in our emergency department. I've learned that trauma medicine exists in a realm where millimeters and seconds determine the difference between miraculous recovery and tragic death, where the human body's capacity for both survival and sudden failure can humble even the most experienced surgeon. Throughout my career, I thought I had developed an almost intuitive understanding of which patients could be saved and which ones were beyond medical intervention. I could walk into a trauma bay, take one look at a patient's injuries, vital signs, and general condition, and predict with remarkable accuracy whether they would survive the next hour, the next day, or the next week. My colleagues often joked that I had some kind of supernatural ability to see death approaching because I rarely called a case incorrectly. This reputation wasn't based on pessimism or giving up on difficult cases. Quite the opposite. I was known throughout the hospital for fighting harder and longer for patients than most surgeons would consider reasonable or cost-effective. Hospital administrators sometimes questioned the resources I devoted to cases that appeared hopeless, but my success rate with supposedly impossible cases had earned me enough credibility to continue practicing medicine according to my own judgment, rather than following standard protocols that prioritized efficiency over individual patient outcomes. I would spend hours in surgery attempting repairs that other doctors considered futile, and I had an unusually high success success rate with cases that were initially classified as hopeless. But my predictions were accurate because they were based on 2 decades of intensive experience, thousands of similar cases, and a deep understanding of human physiology under extreme stress. I had internalized the absolute physical limits of human survival, and I used that knowledge to make split-second decisions about resource allocation, surgical priorities, and honest communication with families about their loved ones' prospects. I knew exactly how much blood loss a human body could tolerate before organ systems began shutting down irreversibly. Through experience with hundreds of cases, I understood that an adult could typically survive losing up to 40% of their blood volume if we could stop the bleeding and provide immediate transfusions. But beyond that threshold, even the most aggressive medical intervention usually failed to prevent multiple organ failure. I understood precisely how long brain tissue could survive without oxygen before permanent damage occurred, generally 4 to 6 minutes of cardiac arrest before irreversible neurological injury, though I had seen rare exceptions where patients recovered normal brain function after longer periods. I could calculate the maximum amount of time that could pass between initial trauma and surgical intervention while still maintaining realistic hope for a meaningful recovery. With internal bleeding, we usually had what we called the golden hour, 60 minutes from the time of injury to get a patient into surgery and control hemorrhaging before blood loss became fatal. With spinal cord injuries, the window was often even shorter. Spinal shock and swelling could cause permanent paralysis within minutes if pressure wasn't relieved immediately. These weren't just academic concepts to me, they were life and death calculations that I made dozens of times every week, knowledge that had been burned into my consciousness through years of watching patients live or die based on my decisions. I had learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated whether someone's body was still fighting for survival or had begun the process of shutting down. Changes in skin color, breathing patterns, pupil response, blood pressure fluctuations, these were the physiological signals that told me whether to continue aggressive treatment or help a family prepare for the inevitable. The case I'm about to describe to you began long before the patient ever arrived at Riverside Metropolitan Medical Center. It started with a woman whose name I would come to know better than members of my own family, whose condition I would monitor and worry about for over 3 years, and whose impossible recovery would force me to question every assumption I had made about the boundaries between life and death. Her name was Isabella Moreau, and when I first learned about her case, she was already considered one of the most tragic medical situations in Arizona's recent history. Isabella had been a 28-year-old environmental engineer working for the state's Department of Water Resources, specializing in groundwater contamination and desert ecosystem preservation. She was brilliant, athletic, adventurous, the kind of person who spent her weekends rock climbing in Sedona, mountain biking through the desert preserve areas around Phoenix, and leading volunteer cleanup efforts along the Salt River and its tributaries. Isabella had graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State University with dual degrees in environmental engineering and geology, maintaining a 3.97 GPA, while also completing undergraduate research projects on water conservation in arid climates. She was pursuing her master's degree in hydrology while working full-time on water conservation projects throughout the state, focusing specifically on the impact of climate change on Arizona's already limited water resources. Her thesis research was examining seasonal variations in groundwater mineral content and their implications for long-term water management policy. By all accounts, Isabella was one of those rare individuals who seemed to approach life with boundless energy and optimism. Her colleagues at the Department of Water Resources described her as someone who could spend 12 hours analyzing complex groundwater contamination data, then drive 2 hours into the desert to photograph wildflowers for her nature photography hobby, then return home to cook elaborate dinners for friends who would gather at her apartment near ASU to discuss environmental policy, plan weekend hiking adventures, and debate solutions to the Southwest's ongoing water crisis. Isabella's apartment reflected her passions, walls covered with her own desert landscape photography, bookshelves filled with technical manuals on hydrology, alongside field guides to southwestern flora and fauna, and a dining room table that usually held both her laptop displaying geological survey maps and equipment for her outdoor adventures. Friends described her as someone who could explain the complex chemistry of groundwater mineralization to a group of state legislators in the morning, then spend the afternoon teaching rock climbing techniques to teenagers from inner-city Phoenix as part of a volunteer outdoor education program she had started. She was also, according to everyone who knew her, extremely safety conscious in all her outdoor activities. This wasn't someone who took unnecessary risks or ignored proper precautions in favor of adrenaline or convenience. Isabella never climbed alone, always carried multiple forms of emergency communication, including satellite phones and GPS beacons, and meticulously planned her routes using topographical maps and recent weather data, and maintained her equipment with the kind of attention to detail that had made her successful in her professional life. Isabella was certified in wilderness first aid through the National Ski Patrol, had completed advanced rock climbing courses at REI and through the Arizona Mountaineering Club, and was known among her hiking groups for being the person who carried extra water, emergency supplies, and backup equipment for everyone else. She had completed wilderness survival training, knew how to navigate by compass and stars if her GPS failed, and always filed detailed itineraries with friends and supervisors before heading into remote areas. A backpack for day hikes contained enough supplies to survive for several days if necessary. Water purification tablets, emergency shelter, fire-starting materials, first aid supplies, high-energy food, and signaling devices. For her work-related trips into remote areas, she carried even more comprehensive safety equipment, including emergency bivouac gear, satellite communication devices, and detailed maps of every area she planned to visit. This background is crucial to understanding what made her accident so shocking and inexplicable to everyone who knew Isabella. Her trauma didn't occur during some reckless adventure, or because she was unprepared for the risks she was taking. It didn't happen while she was pushing the limits of her abilities or ignoring safety protocols to achieve some dangerous goal. It happened during what should have been a routine environmental assessment in an area she had visited dozens of times for both work and recreation, following safety procedures she had established through years of successful field work. On March 8, 2019, Isabella was conducting a solo water quality assessment along Havasu Creek, a location about 150 miles northwest of Phoenix in a remote section of the Tonto National Forest. This was work she had been doing regularly for over 2 years as part of her master's thesis research, involving careful measurements at specific GPS-marked locations along the creek, collection of water samples for later laboratory analysis, and photographic documentation of seasonal changes in vegetation and mineral deposits. The weather that day was perfect for outdoor field work, clear skies with unlimited visibility, temperature in the low 70s, minimal wind and no precipitation forecast for the region. Isabella had informed her supervisor at the Department of Water Resources, her research advisor at ASU, and her roommate about her exact location coordinates and expected return time. She was carrying GPS beacons that would automatically alert search and rescue if she failed to check in, a satellite phone with backup batteries, and enough supplies for 3 days, even though she planned to complete her work and return to Phoenix that same evening. Everything about her preparation and planning followed protocols she had established through years of safe, successful field work in similar remote locations throughout Arizona and New Mexico. She had even called her roommate that morning to confirm her expected return time and discuss dinner plans for that evening. There was absolutely nothing about this particular field trip that suggested unusual risk or danger. What happened next remains partially mysterious even today. Based on the subsequent investigation by the Coconino County Sheriff's Department and the National Forest Service, Isabella appears to have been taking photographs of erosion patterns along a section of creek bank that was elevated approximately 15 feet above the water level. The area wasn't particularly dangerous. She had worked in similar locations hundreds of times, and the slope wasn't steep enough to require specialized climbing equipment or safety ropes. But sometime around 2:30 that afternoon, a section of the creek bank collapsed without warning. Subsequent geological analysis revealed that underground water flow had gradually undermined the stability of the sandstone formation over a period of months or possibly years, creating a large hollow cavity beneath what appeared to be solid ground. When Isabella stepped onto this area while positioning herself for photographs, the weakened surface finally gave way under her weight. Instead of a simple fall onto solid ground or into the creek, Isabella plunged through collapsing rock and debris into a hidden underground cave system that no geological survey had ever documented. The fall was approximately 35 feet through jagged rock formations before she landed in a narrow underground chamber that was partially filled with cold mineralized water from underground springs. The impact of Isabella's 35-foot fall through jagged rock formations should have killed her instantly. When she landed in that narrow underground chamber, her body sustained injuries that no human should survive: multiple skull fractures, both arms broken in several places, her left leg shattered completely, punctured lung, and massive internal bleeding. But those weren't even the worst of her injuries. As Isabella lay unconscious in the underground chamber, the cave-in continued. Rocks and debris kept falling through the opening she had created, and a boulder estimated to weigh over 400 pounds struck her directly in the chest. The impact crushed her rib cage, creating what we call a flail chest, a condition where multiple ribs are broken in multiple places, causing the chest wall to lose structural integrity and making normal breathing virtually impossible. More critically, this same boulder pinned Isabella's lower body underwater in the frigid mineralized creek water that had accumulated in the underground chamber over decades. She was trapped in a position where she could barely breathe due to her crushed chest, couldn't move because of the massive weight crushing her pelvis and legs, and was partially submerged in 40-degree water that would induce fatal hypothermia within hours. Isabella's satellite phone had been destroyed in the fall, buried under tons of rock debris, along with her GPS beacon. The collapse had occurred in one of the most remote sections of the Tonto National Forest, where the chances of anyone accidentally discovering her were essentially zero. Her disappearance wouldn't be noticed until she failed to return that evening, and even then, searchers would have no reason to suspect that the ground itself had opened up and swallowed her. Under these conditions, every medical textbook would predict death within 2 to 3 hours maximum. Flail chest injuries are often fatal, even with immediate medical intervention in a fully equipped trauma center. Combined with probable internal bleeding, multiple fractures, severe head trauma, and progressive hypothermia, Isabella should have lost consciousness and died from shock and respiratory failure long before any rescue became possible. But Isabella Moreau didn't die that afternoon. Somehow, despite injuries that should have been immediately fatal, despite being trapped in conditions that would kill most people within hours, she survived. Not just for hours, but for an entire night, then another day, then another night. For 73 hours total. The search and rescue operation that eventually found Isabella has become legendary among emergency responders throughout the Southwest. It began on the evening of March 8th, when Isabella failed to return home, and her roommate, Jessica Park, contacted the Coconino County Sheriff's Department. The initial search focused on obvious locations. Isabella's vehicle was found at the designated parking area for Havasu Creek access, and her planned research route was well documented in the materials she had left with her supervisor. Search teams spent the entire night of March 8th and all-day March 9th systematically covering every accessible area within a 10-mile radius of where Isabella's car was parked. They deployed helicopters with thermal imaging equipment, ground teams with search dogs, and technical rescue specialists familiar with the area's challenging terrain. They found nothing. No equipment, no footprints, no indication of where she might have gone after leaving her vehicle. The search expanded on March 10th to include areas beyond Isabella's documented route, based on the possibility that she might have deviated from her plan or become disoriented. It wasn't until the afternoon of March 10th, nearly 50 hours after Isabella's disappearance, that searchers noticed an area where the ground appeared to have collapsed recently. Even then, they almost missed it because the cave-in had occurred in a location slightly off Isabella's documented route, and the opening was partially concealed by vegetation and fallen debris. When search and rescue coordinator Maria Santos finally located the opening and realized that someone might have fallen through into an underground chamber, they faced an extremely dangerous technical rescue operation. The hole was too narrow and unstable for conventional rescue equipment. The depth was unknown, and they had no way of determining whether anyone was actually in the chamber below or whether they might still be alive after more than 2 full days. Technical rescue specialist David Chen was the first person to be lowered into the chamber on March 11th, and what he found defied every assumption about human survival under extreme conditions. Isabella was not only alive, she was conscious and alert. Despite her massive injuries, despite being partially submerged in near-freezing water, despite having been trapped for over 70 hours without food, water, or medical attention, she was aware enough to communicate with her rescuers. When I reached her, Chen later reported in his official statement, she looked up at me and said, "I was wondering when you guys would show up. I'm getting pretty cold down here." She was obviously in tremendous pain and clearly severely injured, but she was lucid, coherent, and completely aware of her surroundings. In 15 years of technical rescue work, I've never seen anyone survive that combination of trauma and environmental exposure for that length of time. Throughout the entire rescue process, Isabella remained conscious and cooperative. She answered questions about her condition, provided detailed information about her injuries and level of pain, helped rescuers understand how she was positioned under the boulder, and even apologized to the rescue workers for the difficulty they were having in reaching her. This level of consciousness and cognitive function should have been impossible given the severity of her head trauma, blood loss, and the length of time she had been trapped without medical care. That was my first direct encounter with Isabella Moreau, and it immediately challenged every assumption I had about trauma survival. The woman who arrived in our emergency department that evening should have been dead several times over. According to every principle of trauma medicine I had learned during my 21-year career, her combination of injuries, environmental exposure, and time without medical intervention created a situation that was simply not survivable. I stood there momentarily speechless. Based on her rescue report, Isabella should have been unconscious, in shock, and fighting for her life. Instead, she was making jokes about her work schedule while we prepared to treat injuries that should have killed her days earlier. The emergency surgery lasted 11 hours. Isabella's chest cavity was filled with blood from multiple internal injuries. Her spleen had been ruptured, her liver lacerated in several places, and 3 ribs had punctured her left lung. The flail chest had caused one section of her rib cage to completely separate from the rest of her chest wall. Her left femur was shattered into more than 20 fragments, and both arms had multiple compound fractures with bone fragments protruding through the skin. The surgical team that worked with me that night included our most experienced orthopedic surgeons, neurosurgeons, and thoracic specialists. Each of them individually commented on how impossible Isabella's condition seemed from a medical standpoint. Dr. Robert Kim, our chief neurosurgeon, told me during the operation, "Elena, I've never seen brain trauma this extensive in a patient who remained conscious and coherent. The amount of intracranial pressure and bleeding should have caused immediate coma and death." More remarkably, comprehensive neurological testing showed no evidence of brain damage, cognitive impairment or memory loss, despite her severe skull fractures and the extended period of trauma. Her personality was unchanged, her technical knowledge intact, and her ability to perform complex analytical thinking completely normal. It was as if her brain had somehow protected itself from injuries that should have caused permanent neurological damage. I knew I was badly hurt, Isabella told me during one of our follow-up appointments. I could feel that my chest was crushed and breathing was extremely difficult. I knew my arms and leg were broken, and I was aware that I was losing blood, but I never lost consciousness. I spent those 3 days thinking about my research, planning modifications to my thesis, and working through complex hydrogeological calculations in my head to keep myself mentally active. I consulted with colleagues at major trauma centers across the country, reviewed every piece of medical literature I could find on survival under extreme conditions, and ran comprehensive neurological and psychological evaluations to try to understand Isabella's case. The most logical medical explanations: adrenaline response, hypothermia-induced preservation of brain function, or some kind of metabolic adaptation to extreme conditions, didn't account for the level of consciousness and cognitive function she maintained throughout her ordeal. Other trauma specialists I consulted suggested that Isabella's case might represent some kind of unique physiological adaptation, or possibly that her account of remaining conscious was inaccurate due to memory reconstruction after the fact. But detailed analysis of her blood chemistry, brain imaging, and neurological responses provided no evidence of any medical mechanism that could explain her survival and maintained consciousness. But for all the attention, analysis, and speculation, Isabella's survival and maintained consciousness during those 73 hours remained fundamentally unexplained from a medical and scientific standpoint. Her case represented something that simply shouldn't be possible according to our current understanding of human physiology. Yet it was thoroughly documented and verified by multiple independent sources. Perhaps the most profound impact of Isabella's case on me personally was how it changed my approach to other trauma patients. I began to reconsider every case where I had declared someone beyond medical help, every family I had counseled to prepare for the worst, and every decision I had made to discontinue aggressive treatment because textbooks said recovery was impossible. Isabella Moreau returned to her work at the Arizona Department of Water Resources 6 months after her accident. She completed her master's thesis, which was published in the Journal of Arid Land Studies, and won recognition from the American Water Resources Association. She continues her environmental engineering work, still spends weekends hiking and rock climbing in the Arizona desert, and has become an advocate for improved emergency communication systems in remote areas. But more than 2 years after treating Isabella, I found that I could no longer practice trauma surgery with the confidence and certainty that had once defined my career. Her case had demonstrated that our understanding of human survival limits was incomplete, that consciousness might persist under conditions we thought were impossible, and that the boundary between survivable and fatal trauma was far more mysterious than I had ever realized. 8 months ago, I was consulting on a case involving a young man who had been in a motorcycle accident similar to ones I had treated hundreds of times before. Based on his injuries and vital signs, I was preparing to tell his family that his prognosis was grave and they should prepare for the worst. But as I looked at this patient, all I could think about was Isabella Moreau, conscious and alert after 73 hours of conditions that should have killed her. What if this patient could survive what appeared to be fatal injuries? What if my assessment based on medical textbooks was wrong, just as it would have been wrong about Isabella? How could I authoritatively declare someone beyond hope when I had seen the impossible happen before? I completed that consultation, but I knew I couldn't continue practicing trauma surgery with the level of uncertainty that Isabella's case had created for me. I submitted my resignation from Riverside Metropolitan Medical Center 3 weeks later, citing personal reasons in my resignation letter. The truth was that Isabella's case had fundamentally shaken my confidence in everything I thought I knew about the limits of human survival. Isabella Moreau's case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of impossible trauma survival in medical literature. It continues to be referenced in research papers, discussed at medical conferences, and cited in debates about consciousness trauma treatment protocols and the limits of human endurance. But for me, Isabella's case represents something more profound than a medical anomaly. It serves as a humbling reminder that medicine, despite all our advanced technology and accumulated knowledge, still contains mysteries that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about life, death, and human consciousness. The case of Isabella Moreau will always remain the most unexplained and transformative experience of my medical career. It taught me that trauma surgery, for all its precision and scientific foundation, still operates in a realm where the impossible can become reality, where our understanding of human survival has profound limitations, and where the boundary between life and death may be far more complex and mysterious than we currently comprehend. That's why this case still haunts me, and that's why I could no longer continue practicing medicine with the absolute certainty that effective trauma surgery requires.